Some say the desert is a godless place. But it is only a mirror, reflecting the savagery or the salvation that men carry inside their own hearts. The sun was a merciless hammer over prosperity wells. Dust, fine as flour, coated everything in a shroud of brown. It was the summer of 1882, and the Arizona Territory was dying of thirst. The town's main well had dwindled to a muddy seep, and the fever that came with it was a specter in every home. Ilara Hayes, a woman whose knowledge of herbs had once been a comfort, now found her skills twisted into a mark of witchcraft. The poultices and teas she made were no longer seen as medicine, but as the very source of the town's suffering. Fear, a more potent disease than any fever, had taken root in the hearts of the townsfolk, and it was looking for someone to blame. Her small cabin at the edge of town felt more like a cage. Reverend Gideon Blackwood stood on a crate in the center of the dusty main street, his voice a crack of thunder in the oppressive heat. His black coat absorbed the sun, but he seemed not to feel it, fueled by a righteous fire. The Lord tests us. He sends a scourge to reveal the sin among us. His finger, long and bony, pointed directly at Ilara's home. She works with roots and shadows, a devil's bargain that has poisoned our water and withered our souls. She is a witch, and we must cast her out. The crowd, a collection of desperate, sunburnt faces, murmured in agreement. Their grief and fear needed a vessel, and Blackwood had just given them one. Their eyes, once friendly, now held a dangerous, hard light. Sheriff Brody watched from the doorway of his office, the tin star on his chest feeling heavier than an anvil. He was a man of fading authority, his will eroded by the town's collective panic. He knew Ilara was a good woman. He had seen her sit with sick children and mend broken bones with gentle hands. But he also saw the fury in the eyes of the mob. To stand against them now would be to stand against a flood. "The people have spoken, Ilara," he said, his voice barely a whisper as they dragged her from her home. He could not meet her gaze. He saw only the dust on his boots, a symbol of his own spinelessness. He was a lawman who had just let the law die on his doorstep. The desert welcomed her with a blast of dry, searing air. They did not take her far, just beyond the last vestiges of the dying town, to a place of cracked earth and skeletal saguaros. There, a lone wooden post stood, a remnant of some forgotten fence line. They bound her to it with rough rope that bit into her sunburnt wrists. "May God have mercy on your soul," Blackwood intoned, though his eyes held no mercy at all. Then they left. The townsfolk, her neighbors, turned their backs and walked away, their figures slowly dissolving into the heat haze. Ilara was alone, with only the vast, indifferent sky and the circling vultures for company. The real executioner, the sun, was just beginning its work. The first day was a trial by fire. The sun climbed the sky, a white-hot eye that offered no shade and no reprieve. Ilara's simple cotton dress offered little protection. Her lips cracked, her tongue felt thick and useless in her mouth. Thirst was a living thing, a creature with claws that scraped at her throat. By the second day, the world had begun to melt at the edges. The distant mesas shimmered and danced, and the silence was broken only by the whisper of the hot wind and the patient rustle of vulture wings overhead. Despair was a cool shadow she longed to sink into, a final surrender to the inevitable. She closed her eyes, ready for the end to claim her. A sound, faint and rhythmic, cut through her delirium. Hoofbeats. At first she thought it was a trick of her fevered mind, a phantom hope. But the sound grew steadier, closer. She forced her heavy eyelids open. A figure on horseback emerged from the shimmering heat, moving with a silent grace that seemed part of the land itself. He was not one of the townsfolk. His long, dark hair was held back by a simple band, his deerskin clothing the color of the earth. He rode a sturdy paint horse that seemed untroubled by the heat. The rider pulled his horse to a halt a dozen paces away, his dark eyes taking in the scene without expression. He was a ghost of the desert, a man who belonged to this harsh, beautiful land. He dismounted with fluid ease, his moccasins making no sound on the hard-packed ground. This was Chaitan, a Chiricahua Apache, a man caught between the world of his ancestors and the encroaching world of the white man. He saw the cruelty in the ropes, the barbarism in leaving a human being to the sun. He had seen much to hate in the white man, but the sight of this helpless woman stirred something else inside him. He approached her cautiously. He drew a long, sharp knife from a sheath at his hip. Ilara flinched, but he did not speak. With a few swift, precise motions, he sliced through the ropes, binding her wrists and ankles. She crumpled forward, a dead weight of exhaustion. Chaitan caught her before she hit the ground. She was lighter than he expected, fragile as a dried leaf. Her breathing was shallow, her skin alarmingly hot to the touch. He unslung a water skin from his horse, uncorked it, and gently touched the damp rim to her cracked lips. She moaned softly, a sound of pure agony and relief. He did not let her drink too much. He knew the danger of that. With a strength that belied his lean frame, he lifted her into his arms and placed her carefully onto his horse, settling her in front of him. He wrapped an arm around her to keep her from falling, then urged his horse forward, leaving the post of her torment behind as they melted back into the vast, silent desert. The world returned to Ilara in fragments, the feeling of cool, damp air on her skin, the sound of water dripping slowly, rhythmically, the scent of damp earth and something else, something wild and clean. She opened her eyes to the dim light of a hidden cave. The walls were smooth stone, and a small, clear pool of water collected in a hollow, fed by a steady seep from the rock above. Chaitan sat by a tiny, smokeless fire, grinding something in a stone bowl. He had removed her torn dress and covered her with a soft blanket. He had tended to her sunburned skin with a soothing poultice that smelled of aloe. He was not a savage, he was a healer. For days he nursed her back from the brink of death. He would bring water to her lips in a cupped hand, letting her sip slowly. He fed her a thin broth made from roots he had gathered, a substance that was surprisingly nourishing. He moved with a quiet purpose, his presence a comforting silence in the cool sanctuary of the cave. When she was finally strong enough to speak, her voice was a dry rasp. "Why?" she asked, the single word costing her a great effort. Chaitan looked up from his work, his dark eyes meeting hers. "No one should die like that," he said simply. His English was clear, with only a slight accent. "Not even an enemy." As her strength returned, they began to talk, their words carefully chosen, bridging the chasm between their two worlds. Ilara told him about the fever in Prosperity Wells, about the well water that had turned against them. Chaitan listened, his face impassive, but his eyes were sharp with intelligence. Then he told her his own story. He spoke of the stolen river, a stream that had once flowed through this valley, giving life to all. He explained how the white settlers had blocked it upstream, diverting the water for their own purposes, leaving the valley and the town to wither and die. This was not a curse from God, it was the work of men. Ilara saw a profound sadness in his eyes as he spoke. He was an outcast too. His own people viewed him with suspicion, because he had tried to learn the white man's ways, believing knowledge was the only path to survival. He had learned their language, but in doing so had distanced himself from his tribe. She was cast out for her knowledge, he for his. In the cool darkness of the hidden cave, two lonely souls found a fragile, unspoken understanding. It was a trust born not of words, but of shared solitude and a dawning realization that they were both victims of the same brand of ignorance and greed. Bartholomew Finch surveyed his domain from the porch of his sprawling ranch house. The adobe structure was a monument to his greed, its green lawns and flourishing gardens, an insult to the parched valley below. Finch was a man of immense appetite and no conscience. He had come to the Arizona territory with a singular goal: to own it all. The dying town of Prosperity Wells was a key piece in his plan. Once the settlers were desperate enough, they would sell their land for pennies on the dollar. He puffed on a thick cigar, the smoke curling into the hot, still air. His plan was working perfectly. The fever and fear were his most valuable allies. In his cool, dark study, Finch met with his puppet. Reverend Gideon Blackwood accepted a heavy pouch of gold coins, the clink of the metal a sweet hymn to his ears. "The flock is restless, but they believe," Blackwood reported, his voice losing its thunderous quality. becoming slick and conspiratorial. They see the woman as the source of all their troubles. Finch smiled, a cold, thin expression. Excellent. Keep their eyes on your phantom witch, Reverend. A frightened herd is an easy one to manage. Make sure they remain focused on damnation, not dehydration. Blackwood nodded eagerly. His soul had been for sale for a long time, and Finch was a generous buyer. A scout, weary and dust-covered, brought Finch unwelcome news. The woman, Alara Hayes, was not dead. She had been rescued by an Apache. Finch's good mood evaporated. Loose ends made him nervous. He summoned his foreman, a ruthless gunman named Corcoran, whose reputation was as grim as the desert at midnight. Corcoran was a man with cold, empty eyes and a revolver that had settled many disputes. "A savage has my witch," Finch snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "I want them both found. I want them erased. Silence them for good. Dead men do not cause complications." Corcoran simply nodded, a promise of violence in the gesture. Corcoran was an expert tracker. He gathered his hand-picked riders, men as merciless as himself, and set out from the ranch. It was not easy. The Apache had covered his trail with the skill of a ghost, but Corcoran was patient. He found a single, faint hoofprint in a patch of sand, a broken twig, a disturbed stone. He was like a wolf on a blood trail, relentless and single-minded. Days turned into a week. Back in the hidden cave, Alara and Chayton were unaware of the closing net. They were finding a rhythm, a quiet peace in their isolation, while just beyond the horizon, death was riding toward them on a fast horse. The attack came at dawn. A rifle shot echoed through the canyon, the bullet splintering the rock near the cave entrance. Corcoran and his men had found them. They were trapped. Chayton moved with lightning speed, pushing Alara deeper into the cave. "Stay back," he commanded, his voice tight. He grabbed his bow and a quiver of arrows. He was a warrior, and this was his land, but he knew the odds were against them. The repeated crack of rifles pinned him down. The gunmen were spread out, using the rocks for cover, methodically closing in on the cave mouth. They were not trying to kill him yet. They were enjoying the hunt, cornering their prey. Chayton was a phantom among the rocks at the cave's entrance. He loosed an arrow, and one of the gunmen cried out, clutching his shoulder. But for every arrow he had, they had 100 bullets. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder. He knew he could not hold them off forever. They were a patient, venomous breed. While he drew their fire, Ilara's mind raced. She was not a warrior, but she was not helpless. Her eyes scanned the cave, falling upon the pouch of herbs and roots she had gathered to aid her own recovery. She remembered the properties of each one, the good and the bad. An idea, desperate and dangerous, took hold. She grabbed a handful of dried poison ivy from her pouch. It was a risk, a terrible one, but it was their only chance. As Chayton loosed another arrow, distracting the men, Ilara crawled to the small fire pit near the entrance. She tossed the leaves onto the embers. A thick, acrid smoke billowed out of the cave mouth, carried on the morning breeze directly into the gunman's position. The effect was immediate. Cries of surprise turned into choked coughs and pained gasps. The rifle fire became erratic as men clawed at their eyes and throats, temporarily blinded and unable to breathe. In the ensuing chaos, Chayton seized the opportunity. He moved from cover, his knife a blur of motion, disarming one man while another stumbled away, choking. But a lucky shot from a recovering gunman caught Chayton in the shoulder, spinning him around. He grunted in pain, stumbling back toward the cave. The smoke was already beginning to dissipate. "Now!" Ilara cried, grabbing his good arm. She pulled him toward a narrow fissure at the back of the cave, a passage he had shown her. They squeezed through the tight opening just as Corcoran and his men, their faces red and swollen, stormed the main entrance. They had escaped, but they were wounded, and the desert was a hard place for the hunted. They found a new refuge in a narrow, high-walled canyon, a place so remote even the buzzards seemed to ignore it. Ilara tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat to make a clean bandage. The bullet had gone clean through Chayton's shoulder, a painful but not a fatal wound. She worked with quiet efficiency, cleaning the wound with water from their skin and applying a poultice of chewed yucca root to stave off infection. He bore the pain with a stoicism that amazed her, his only sign of discomfort, a tightening of his jaw. Her touch was gentle, her brow furrowed in concentration. In that moment, he was not a warrior, he was just a man in her care. The shared danger had forged a new intimacy between them. As she tended to his wound, their eyes met, and a silent understanding passed between them. It was more than gratitude, more than partnership. It was a fragile, budding affection born in the harshest of circumstances. "Your medicine is strong," Chaitin said, his voice low. "My people have known these plants for generations," she replied softly. "They are only a danger to those who are ignorant of them." The words hung in the air, a clear parallel to her own situation with the people of Prosperity Wells. They were both misunderstood, their gifts seen as threats. As he rested, they talked, piecing together the puzzle of their persecution. His story of the stolen river, the rumors of Finch's insatiable greed, the sudden sickness that conveniently drove down land prices, and now the relentless pursuit by hired guns. It all pointed to a single ugly truth. Bartholomew Finch was not just stealing water, he was systematically destroying a town to possess its bones. "He used their fear," Ilara whispered, the realization settling like a stone in her stomach. "And Reverend Blackwood was his mouthpiece. They created a witch so no one would look for a monster." Their purpose became clear. This was no longer just about survival, it was about justice. They had to expose Finch, not only to clear Ilara's name, but to save the dying town. A town that had cast her out. "There must be proof," Chaitin said, his gaze fixed on the canyon walls. "A man like that, a white man, he will have papers, plans, letters." Their personal quest for vindication had merged with a greater cause. They would fight not just for themselves, but for the very people who had condemned her. And in this shared mission they found a strength that neither of them possessed alone. They had a reason to fight and a reason to live. The Finch Ranch was a fortress, a sprawl of adobe and timber under the watchful eyes of armed guards. To approach it was to invite a bullet. But Chaitin knew the land. He knew its secrets, its hidden pathways carved by wind and water. As darkness fell, painting the desert in shades of indigo and violet, he led Ilara toward the ranch. They moved like shadows, their footsteps silent, using the deep arroyos and thickets of mesquite for cover. The air was tense, alive with the chirping of crickets and the distant lonely howl of a coyote. Every rustle of a leaf, every dislodged pebble, felt like a thunderclap. This was Finch's lair, and they were walking directly into it. They reached the source of the valley's misery just before midnight. It was a crude, ugly structure of earth and timber, thrown across the riverbed with brutal efficiency. The dam. Behind it, a vast, placid lake shimmered in the moonlight, a stolen treasure of water. Below it, the riverbed was nothing but a scar of dry, cracked mud. The sight of it filled Ilara with a cold fury. This was the true curse, a monument to one man's greed. Chaitin placed a hand on her arm, a silent command to remain calm. Their goal was not the dam itself, but the proof that lay within the ranch house. They slipped past a sleeping guard and headed for the main building. The ranch office was a small, detached building. The lock was simple, and Chaitin's knife made short work of it. Inside, the room smelled of stale cigar smoke and leather. A large desk dominated the space, covered in maps and ledgers. While Chaitin stood guard at the window, his eyes scanning the moonlit yard, Ilara began a frantic search. She sifted through papers with trembling hands, her heart pounding with every creak of the floorboards. She found shipping manifests, cattle counts, wage ledgers. It was all mundane. For a terrifying moment, she thought they had risked everything for nothing. Then she saw it. Tucked away in a locked drawer, which Chaitin quickly forced open, was a slim portfolio. Inside were the engineering plans for the dam, clearly labeled with the Finch Ranch name. And beneath them, a collection of letters. They were from a land speculator in Santa Fe, discussing the purchase of properties in the Verde Valley as soon as the current drought and sickness drove the owners to ruin. The letters explicitly mentioned Finch's role in creating these very conditions. It was all there, in black and white. The perfect, undeniable proof of his conspiracy. They had found the monster's heart. They rode into Prosperity Wells at high noon, not as fugitives, but as messengers. Their sudden appearance on the main street caused an immediate stir. Doors opened, and faces peered out, a mixture of fear, hatred, and raw curiosity. They did not slow until they reached the saloon, the unofficial center of the town. Sheriff Brody was inside, nursing a warm beer, his face a mask of weary resignation. Ilara and Chayton walked through the swinging doors, the sudden silence in the saloon as profound as the desert at midnight. All eyes turned to them, the woman they had condemned and the Apache who was with her. "Sheriff," Ilara said, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the fear she felt. "We know why the town is sick. We know who is responsible." She placed the portfolio of papers on a dusty table in front of him. "It is not a curse, it is a crime." Sheriff Brody stared at the papers, his hand trembling slightly as he reached for them. He began to read, his eyes widening with each line. Around the room, a low murmur started to build. The men who had been so quick to form a mob now exchanged uncertain glances. The face of Mrs. Gable, whose son Ilara had once nursed through a lung fever, softened with a flicker of doubt. The saloon doors burst open, and Bartholomew Finch strode in, flanked by Corcoran and two of his gunmen. Reverend Blackwood followed close behind, his face a mask of pious outrage. "What is the meaning of this?" Finch boomed, his eyes immediately locking on the papers in the sheriff's hands. "Sheriff, are you entertaining the ravings of this witch and her heathen companion?" Blackwood pointed a shaking finger at Ilara. "Do not be fooled by their lies. This is the devil's work, a deception to lead you all to ruin. They are the blight on this land." Finch smiled, a predator's expression of utter confidence. He believed his power and the town's fear were walls he could hide behind forever. "She is a known liar, Sheriff, and he is a savage. Whose word are you going to take?" The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken threats. Corcoran's hand rested casually on the handle of his revolver. Sheriff Brody looked from the damning letters to Finch's arrogant face, and then to the small, hopeful flicker in Mrs. Gable's eyes. The entire town, its past and its future, seemed to hang on his next words. The moment of truth had arrived, and it was as hot and unforgiving as the Arizona sun. Sheriff Brody slowly folded the letters and placed them inside his coat. He stood up, and for the first time in months, he seemed to stand a little taller. The weight of his guilt had been replaced by the heavier burden of decision. He looked directly at Bartholomew Finch, his gaze steady. "Bartholomew Finch," he said, his voice quiet but carrying through the silent room. "You are under arrest for the theft of water and for endangering the lives of this entire community." A collective gasp went through the saloon. No one had ever dared to stand up to Finch. It was unthinkable. Corcoran let out a short, harsh laugh. "You and what army, Sheriff?" he sneered, his hand moving from his sidearm's handle to its grip. The movement was a spark in a room full of gunpowder. But before Corcoran could draw, a shotgun clicked loudly from the bar. The bartender, a man named Silas who had seen too many good people suffer, was holding an old scattergun. "He has got me," Silas said grimly. That one act of courage broke the spell of fear. An old rancher near the door drew his own worn revolver. "And me," he growled. The balance of power in the room had suddenly, violently shifted. The saloon erupted into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouting. Finch's men were fast, but the townsfolk were desperate. Chayton, moving with incredible speed, pushed Ilara behind the heavy oak bar next to Silas. He returned fire with a rifle he had taken from his horse, his shots precise and deadly. He was not fighting for vengeance, but to protect the woman who had trusted him. Ilara, her fear replaced by a fierce resolve, began reloading the shotgun for Silas, her hands moving with a swift, steady purpose. They were a team, bound by the battle raging around them. The fight was short and brutal. In the confusion, Reverend Blackwood made a dash for the back door but was struck by a stray bullet and fell without a sound. Corcoran, a formidable gunman, was brought down by the combined fire of the sheriff and the old rancher. Bartholomew Finch, his arrogance shattered, found himself cornered, his face a mask of disbelief and terror. Sheriff Brody approached him, the smoke swirling around his boots. The fight was over. A bloody, painful justice had been delivered on the floorboards of the town saloon, paid for by the courage of a few good men. The following morning, a work party of townsfolk, led by Sheriff Brody, rode out to the dam. With axes, shovels, and grim determination, they tore the structure apart. A great cheer went up as the first trickle of water broke through, quickly swelling into a muddy, joyous torrent. The river, the lifeblood of the valley, was free. It flowed back into its ancient bed, promising to wash away not just the drought and the fever, but also the shame and fear that had poisoned the town's soul. Prosperity Wells had a chance to heal, to be reborn from its own ashes. When Ilara and Chayton prepared to leave, a small delegation of citizens approached them. Mrs. Gable, her eyes filled with tears, spoke for them all. "We were wrong, Ilara, blinded by fear. Please forgive us. Stay. Be our healer again. This is your home." Ilara looked at the faces, no longer twisted by hatred but filled with sincere remorse. A part of her was tempted. She could have a home, a place of respect. But then she looked at Chayton, who stood silently beside his horse, his presence a quiet anchor in her world. He would never truly be welcome here. And she knew, with absolute certainty, that she could no longer be home without him. "My home is no longer a place on a map," she told them gently, her voice full of a sadness and a strength they had never heard before. She walked over to Chayton, and he helped her onto his horse, his touch warm and familiar. They had faced death together in the desert, fought for justice in the town, and found in each other a belonging that no community could offer. Their bond had been forged in fire and thirst, sealed with trust and sacrifice. It was a bond stronger than any law or prejudice. Their future was not here, among the ghosts of their shared ordeal. They rode out of Prosperity Wells not as outcasts, but as sovereigns of their own destiny. They did not look back. Before them, the vast, open country stretched to the horizon, a land of endless possibility. They were headed west, toward the setting sun, with no specific destination in mind. They were two people from different worlds who had found their own nation in each other. The curse that had haunted Ilara was finally broken, not by prayer or magic, but by the simple, powerful truths of courage, justice, and a love that had blossomed in the most unforgiving of lands. They were free,